Hello, everyone. My name is Corey, and I'm a content and support engineer here at Geocodio. Today, we're going to talk about how to integrate your Ruby or Rails application with the Geocodio API using our Ruby library. This is a great tool that we have built to help simplify calling our API and receiving location-specific data about an address or a pair of coordinates. In this tutorial, we're going to talk specifically about how to call the Geocodio API and receive information about a single address. We'll go into additional subjects like reverse geocoding, batch geocoding, and appending different fields to your results in future tutorials. If you'd like some more information about our API and how to use it, sort of without having to wait for additional tutorials down the line, you're welcome to go over to our Geocodio documentation. I'm going to include a link to this in the description down below, but make sure you check it out if you have any questions, or if you just want to see all of this kind of together in one spot. This has some amazing resources that will walk you through basically all of the features of our API. And if you click on this Ruby tab right here, you'll actually see code examples of what we're going to go over today and in the future. So for example, this single address option here under the Ruby tab, you can see how that would be configured, how it would be used, and how we'll go ahead and call the API using this .geocode method. So there's a lot of great resources here, especially if you just want to sort of check out what we've talked about in a different format. But for right now, let's go ahead over to VS Code and we'll kind of talk a little bit about how this is set up and what we're going to do with it. So you can see here, I've already generated a Rails application. And here, I basically built a very, very simple application that's going to call the API and then hopefully render the response as JSON in our browser. So I created this API calls controller, just named it what I thought made the most sense. And in that controller is this call Geocodio method. And this is where we're going to put the vast majority of our code. You can also see that I've required .env Rails. .env is one of a number of different options you have to access the .env file in your Rails or Ruby application. I'm using this in particular to house my API key from Geocodio. And obviously for security reasons, I don't want to show you that right now. And for your own purposes, if you're going to push to GitHub or to Git, you may want to hide your API key in a .env file. So if you'd like to do that, there's lots of resources on how to use .env and .env Rails, but that's why I've gone ahead and required that. If you need an API key still and you haven't gotten one, you're welcome to go over to your Geocodio account. Just go to your dashboard, and in the API keys tab, you can either generate a new one or you can find some API keys that already exist. So that's how the controller is set up for right now. We can also take a look at our gem file. This is where we're going to install everything that we need. And then finally, I have my routes config file. And I've gone ahead and set up a simple sort of URL /call Geocodio, which in my browser, when I call this on my local host, it's going to trigger that method that we've created in the controller. So there's nothing in there yet, but once we've started adding some things in there, we'll kind of get that route working for us. So let's hop over to our gem file. And here we're going to do a couple of things. So the first gem that we want to install, and the most important, arguably, because it's the one that we're talking about today, is the Geocodio-gem. And just to verify, make sure that you're spelling it exactly like this, because this is our first party gem. And then we also have a couple of third party options as well. And I'm working specifically with this one today. And so any of the instructions I'm providing will be specific to this gem. Then we also want to install a couple of dependencies. The first is Faraday. Now, if you already have Faraday or Faraday follows redirects, which is going to be our second one, follow redirects. If you already have these, then you don't have to install them again. but they are dependencies for the Geocodio gem. And if they're not installed, you could potentially run into some dependency errors. I've had that happen in the past. So just to kind of make sure that everything's running correctly, I would add Faraday and Faraday follow redirects. This is an HTML client that makes calling APIs really easy, and that works in conjunction with the Geocodio gem to kind of make sure everything's running smoothly. So we've got everything we need here. I'm going to save that. And then let's bundle install just to make sure that we've got what we need. Cool, that's great. Now that we've got our gem installed, let's jump back over to our API calls controller. All right, so here is our API calls controller. And the first thing we want to do is we want to require our Geocodio gem. And there's a small difference here between how we're requiring our new gem and how we installed it. You'll notice there's a slash instead of a dash. This has to do with how the gem is structured. It's namespaced. So you want to make sure that this is how you're requiring it, because if you try to use a dash here, it might have some trouble recognizing the gem. So just make sure, when you're requiring, you're including that slash. Now let's go into our call Geocodio method here. The first thing we want to do is we want to create an instance of this Geocodio gem. We want to assign it to a variable, and then we want to pass in our API key so that Geocodio can see our credentials, basically giving us authorization to make geocoding calls. So let's go ahead and just call this Geocodio. And then we're going to assign that to Geocodio. And then we're going to put our two colons there to indicate a namespace. Gem.new. This creates a new instance of the gem. And then since I'm using .env Rails, I'm going to go ahead and pass in env API key. Now, if you're just testing things out, if you don't intend to push to GitHub or anything like that, you can just pass in your API key as a string here. I'm just being extra secure. But if you have any plans of putting your code online, definitely make sure you're securing your API key with .env or with some other option. But that's definitely what I'm going to do moving forward. But you can kind of picture this right here should be a string containing your API key. However you want to do that, in whatever secure manner you would like to do that. So now we have an instance. We have the Geocodio gem available, and that gives us access to a bunch of different methods that we can call to access the API and get a response. And in this case, we're just going to geocode a single address, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create another variable. We'll call this location. And on my Geocodio object, we're going to run the geocode method and set up some parentheses here. And within these parentheses, we're going to pass in an array. And since we're only doing that one address, I'm going to pass in a string into that array. This is just the White House. And now, with this information taken care of, this is as simple as it needs to be. .geocode, pass in your address within an array. And the reason this is an array, you'll see when we batch geocode, is that you can actually pass in more than one string if you would like. But that's not what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about that further down the line. So with that taken care of, let's render it so we can see it and test to make sure that everything's running the way that we want it to run. So I'm going to go ahead and render JSON that location variable. So one more time, just going to walk you through this. In our call Geocodio method, which will be called when we enter /call geocode in our browser, we're going to create a brand new instance of a Geocodio gem and pass in our API key for credentials. And then on that sort of variable, we now have access to all of those methods. We're going to call .geocode on the Geocodio variable, and within an array, pass a string that contains your address information. So this is all you need. we should be more or less ready to go. So I'm going to make sure all of that's saved, and then let's run a quick Rails server to test everything out. Cool, that's up and running. All right, let's open this up, and in localhost 3000, we're going to run call Geocodio. Let's hope everything's working. There we go. So you can see after calling Geocodio in my browser, we now have a ton of JSON information that gives us the results for that API call. So everything's good. We have successfully called the Geocodio API regarding a single address, and we've gotten back information about that address. This is awesome. It's just the first step of many. But if you're just trying to make very quick, very simple individual API calls on one address at a time, this is a great tool for you. You're already ready to go. But when I come back next time, we're going to talk about how to reverse geocode, basically taking a set of coordinates and turning it into an address using the Geocodio API and the Ruby library as well. But I hope you've learned a lot today. I hope this is a great resource for you. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. I will definitely address them as I can and as I'm available. If you have something that's a little more timely or you need a little bit of a faster response to, feel free to email support@Geocodio. That's geocod.io. And that will send you to our customer support, and we'll go ahead and try to address any of your questions there as quickly as we can. I really hope you'll join me for our next tutorial, but until then, happy geocoding.